This is a little recording on solving polynomial equations. Okay. So we're going to be taking a look at page 193, number 12, and the instructions are: use factoring and the zero product property to solve the equation. So if you're not familiar with this, we will definitely take a look at this. But the first thing is it says use factoring. Okay, so we have to factor, and remember, factoring is kind of like the reverse of the distributive property. And what we're going to do is we need to take a look at this equation and we need to factor it. Well, first thing we know, we see that it's set up to be equal to 0, which is the form that we need it to be in to be able to apply the zero product property. Now we see we have two terms, and what we need to do is we need to take a look at each term and figure out what they have in common, so what we can pull out. So we'll take a look at the coefficients. Now remember that the coefficient is a numerical factor, right? Numerical value that is kind of attached to a variable through multiplication, and that's what a factor is, right? A factor is when things are kind of combined through with multiplication. We're going to talk a little bit about that later on. So we see the coefficient of the x squared is a 2, and the coefficient of an x, of this x here, is a 3. Do they have anything common? Do they have anything that we can pull out? No, they don't, right? They're fine. Now we take a look at the variables, right? X squared, and we have an x. Well, what do they have in common? They have an x, and so we can pull an x out of both of these. So we'll say x, right, times 2x plus 3 equals 0. Let me see if I can make this fine. Oh, okay. Oh, arrow options. So now that we did that, we factored the equation, right? We factored it out, and it's given us two factors. It's given us this factor x, right, and the factor 2x plus 3. So, but before we move on, let's take a look at the zero product property. Let's just take a look at if we have two factors, a times b equals 0, right? We've got two separate factors. Well, what would one of these factors have to be in order for this equation to be equal to 0? Well, either one of them would have to be equal to 0 itself. And why? Because 0 times anything is 0. So let's just take a look at it when a is equal to 0. So this is 0 times b equals 0. Well, 0 times anything. It doesn't matter what b is. B could be a Cadillac. It doesn't matter. It's, anything times 0 is 0. So there we have 0 equals 0. This is true. It checks out. Well, what's the other possible scenario we have? The other possible scenario that we have is b could be equal to 0. So let's take a look and say a times 0 is equal to 0. Well, a times 0, anything times 0. The rules do not change midstream. They are still the same. So we've got a times 0 is going to be equal to 0. That checks out right there. So what we're saying here, the zero product property, is as long as any of the factors are 0. If any of the factors are 0, it will make a true statement. Okay? And that's what, so then we come over here and say, okay, well, we've got a factor. We've got a factor of x, and we've got this other factor. Right now it's in parentheses, but the whole factor is 2x plus 3. This is glommed together with the parentheses, so you'll have to treat it as a single unit. So that is its own factor. So we have two factors. We have x and 2x plus 3. So what do we say? We say, well, what happens when x is equal to 0? We'll set the factors equal to 0. X equals 0. What do we get? Well, let's make everything, wherever you see an x, make it equal to 0. That's what it says. X is equal to 0. So 0 times 2 times 0 plus 3 equals 0. Well, look at this. We have 0 times something. 0 times a whole, a factor. So whenever we get that, it's going to be 0. Let's just work through it just to make sure. 2 times 0 is 0, plus 3 equals 0. Well, 0 plus 3 is 3, so we have 0 times 3 equals 0. Voila, it works out. Look at that. 0 times 3 is just going to be 0. Is equal to 0, so it checks. Now we know that one of the possible solutions is 0. Now, let's take a look at the other factor. Here comes the challenging part. Let's take a look at this factor here, 2x plus 3. So we're going to say the factor 2x plus 3. Well, we need that to be equal to 0 too. Okay, well now we have an equation, so in order to figure out what x has to be, we have to solve the equation. Well, we've solved 1,000,000 of these equations by now. Well, maybe not that many, but a lot, right? And you can see what I'm doing here. Hopefully you understand what I'm doing here because you've done it a few times. So we end up with x equals -3/2. So what this is saying is when x is equal to -3/2, it'll make this factor here equal to 0. Well, let's just check it out. So it says wherever you see an x, put -3/2. So we'll say -3/2 times 2 times -3/2 plus 3, all in parentheses, equals 0. Well, we have -3/2. Well, 2 times, we'll make this a fraction, 2 over 1. Well, the 2's cancel out. And we've got 1 times -3. Well, that's just -3. -3 plus 3 equals 0. -3/2. Well, -3 and a +3, you combine them, you get 0. Oh, look at that. Look at that. The factor became 0. 0 times -3/2 is just going to be 0. 0 equals 0. It checks out. So therefore, the solution set, or what makes this true, is negative when x is equal to -3/2 and when x is equal to 0. Okay, I hope you found this helpful.